Okay, I'm doing two things in one. First of all, getting your attention by clapping, and secondly, saying that maybe it's time to start. I'm very happy to have Jonathan Kay, who is now the editor of the Walrus magazine, a magazine that if you don't know, you should know and may subscribe to. And previously, he was the opinion page editor of the National Post, where I probably got to know him most. He wrote in 2011, he wrote a book called Among the Truthers, where he described the varieties of conspiracy theories and believers and so on. And I thought that it's a subject that is quite interesting these days, especially that we have in Washington a president who believes in all kinds of strange conspiracies and alternative facts. And I think that Jonathan can probably say something both about the old conspiracy theories and maybe Trump's kind of contribution to this kind of culture. So there you go, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much. As our host mentioned, I wrote this book in 2011. And it was called Among the Truthers. I think the subtitle was A Voyage into America's Conspiracist Underground. And I wrote about the mindset of conspiracy theorists, and I interviewed many of them. And in the last 6 months or so, people have come up to me and they said, "Oh, wow, you were ahead of the curve. You predicted a lot of the stuff that's going on in Washington." And I say to them, "Well, thank you for the compliment, but that's not true at all. I didn't predict it. Because when I wrote the book, I wrote about conspiracism as, I would say, a fringe phenomenon, because a lot of people believe conspiracy theories, but I described it as a philosophy of people who lack power, people who are frustrated, people who are on the margins of society, people who use conspiracy theories in part to explain why they had become disenfranchised from society. And never in the course of 300 pages in the book did I even come close to suggesting that one of these conspiracy theorists was going to become the most important and powerful people in the entire world. The President of the United States. That seemed ludicrous. So, despite the fact that I spent all these years researching the book and wrote all the 80,000 words or however long it was, I never came close to the truth of the matter, which was that conspiracism was such a powerful and seductive philosophy that it would animate the rise of the President of the United States. Donald Trump is actually a very interesting example of a conspiracy theorist, because in my book, this is, every chapter is my favorite chapter, but there's one chapter that I often point to as, I think, being perhaps the most likely to be useful to people who are interested in conspiracy theorists, because it's a sort of typology of the sort of individuals who become conspiracy theorists. So I talk about people, I think I call them seekers. They're the sort of people who are into astrology and sort of esoteric kinds of health food and crystals, and they sort of dabble in Eastern religions that they don't understand that well. They often have like a dream catcher dangling from the rearview mirror of their car. And these are people who are just like, they're looking for the truth that lurks beyond the reality that we see in front. And conspiracy theories is part of that sort of search for the hidden meaning of things. So that's one category. They're often very gentle souls, and they're not violent at all, and they're not nuisances on social media, as many conspiracy theorists are. And then I described there's a very small component of conspiracy theorists who are actually, unfortunately, they're mentally ill, although they're not as numerous as you might think, although there's some of them are like that. And then I described one category that I call the failed historian. And the failed historian, you often see this kind of conspiracy theorist represented among strong nationalists. So people who are extremely ardent Zionists, or extremely ardent anti-Zionists, or they're extremely ardent Islamists, or they're extremely ardent anti-Islamists, or they embrace some strong geopolitical ideological creed. And because they feel so passionately in this creed, they want to make sure that everything they know about the world aligns with that creed. So, for instance, if there's somebody who believes passionately in the idea that the United States is the root of all evil, they are going to find coping mechanisms to help them align the news they read about on TV or in a newspaper or on the internet with this ideology they have in order to prevent cognitive dissonance. So they will create theories, for instance, to show how 9/11 was actually engineered as a false flag operation by George W. Bush. Or if they believe deeply, deeply, deeply in their heart that America is a deeply conservative Christian country and it would never elect someone like Barack Obama, this urban, secular-leaning, Ivy League, hyper-liberal Democrat to the presidency, it just doesn't align with their vision of the U.S. electorate, they will create a bridge mechanism to bridge between the reality of Barack Obama's election and their conception of the United States, and that's birtherism. Because birtherism allows them to hold both truths at the same time and avoid cognitive dissonance, because they allow themselves to believe, okay, Barack Obama's president, I get that, but he's president because he's counterfeit. He tricked people. He's actually an illegal president. And as soon as I unmask the illegality of his presidency, I can set the world right. And that's one of the things that the failed historian often, that's the reason for getting up in the morning, is that they think that if they can awaken people to the truth, whatever their idea, the self-jihad is coming and Justin Trudeau is going to impose Sharia on Canada, or, Alex Jones's fantasies about FEMA concentration camps enslaving America and taking away all our weapons. They see themselves as Paul Revere figures. In fact, Paul Revere is a very fabled character in the conspiracist community in the United States, because many conspiracy theorists see themselves in that mold as somebody who's alerting the population at large to these secret truths that they have about the powers that secretly control the world. Donald Trump is actually a very interesting person in the conspiracist community because he exhibits some of the tendencies of the false, or I should say failed historian, in that he uses conspiracy theories as a way to bridge reality and his delusions. But it's not because of any strongly held ideological, geopolitical conviction, or because he's particularly religious, or anything like that. Rather, he exhibits what many people would consider to be narcissistic personality disorder. Yeah. I'm not a psychiatrist, and even if I were a psychiatrist, it's considered unethical within the mental health community to diagnose a person without observing them clinically. But many people I know who are in the mental health community have said that Donald Trump does exhibit some of the symptoms of someone afflicted with narcissistic personality disorder. For instance, he becomes pathologically agitated at criticism. He becomes self-destructive in his desire to refute criticism. He's obsessed with signs of wealth and stature and his ordinal ranking on, the tallest towers and the most wealth and all this sort of thing. So his ideology is rooted in his egoism. And so if you look at the conspiracy theories that Donald Trump has created, they tend to revolve around alleviating the dissonance that exists between his conception of himself, which, like all narcissistic people, relentlessly, he always has to be perceived as the best of everything, number one at everything, with the reality that, like all human beings, he's never going to be the best. His inauguration was not as well attended as other presidential inaugurations. The healthy psychological response to that is, okay, the weather wasn't great, it was a controversial election, some people don't like me, Washington is a very liberal city, perhaps it's understandable that a lot of people didn't come out to see Donald Trump. Whatever, that's the way most people in this room, I think, if we were elected president of the United States, we might deal with a sparsely attended inauguration. We're Canadian, maybe that's why people can come to our inauguration as U.S. president. But in his case, that just didn't compute, so he spent the first week of his presidency constructing increasingly elaborate theories about how somehow more people came to his inauguration than to Barack Obama's inauguration, despite the clear photographic evidence that wasn't true. Now, there are many people who would devote exactly that same amount of time to analyzing JFK photographs or historical photographs from 1917 and thereafter to prove that the Armenian genocide is just a myth concocted by Turkey's enemy. Looking at old photographs and documents for signs of forgery and tampering is one of the favorite hobbies of all conspiracy theorists. But usually they do it in the service of some ideological cause or religious conviction. Some attempt to rewrite history. If you're a Holocaust denier, which is a kind of conspiracy, you're usually doing it to rehabilitate the Nazis because you have hateful Nazi views. Donald Trump, for him it's about rehabilitating Donald Trump and aligning the conceit of being supreme in every field of endeavor with the reality that no human being, no matter how successful, can be supreme in every field of endeavor. And you saw it again with his obsessive and bizarre claim that somehow he had won the popular vote, even though very simple arithmetic actuarial accounting of the votes cast indicated, I believe that Hillary Clinton, I think it was 2.8 million votes surplus vote. But, it was because all these illegal people voted, and he had some story about how he'd run into this German former professional golfer who had some garbled anecdote about how he tried to vote, but he was prevented from voting, and this golfer said he wasn't even an American citizen. These are stories that any one of us would be embarrassed to repeat because they were so weird, even if we're not president of the United States. But a conspiracy theorist is so agitated by this dissonance that exists in their mind between the world that they want and the world that exists that they lose track of what seems like an unhinged position to take on something as basic as how many human beings voted or how many human beings attended your inauguration. So he's an interesting example of how narcissistic personality disorder can generate its own subgenus of conspiracism, I guess you could call it. But the people who support Donald Trump, they don't all have narcissistic personality disorder, but many of them have a more conventional kind of ideological zeal. They want to make America great again. And what's interesting, actually, is in a lot of types of conspiracism, the idea that the world was once a wonderful, Edenic place and has somehow been corrupted by a group of evildoers is actually a core element of many conspiracist beliefs. If you talk to many anti-Semites, for instance, they will talk about how Europe was a wonderful, peaceful, pluralistic, pastoral place until those rootless cosmopolitans swept in with their usury and their capitalism and their liberalism, and they financed the coups that deposed historical kings and ruined society. And society has been ruined ever since and will remain so until the nefarious plot is revealed to the world. Muslim conspiracy theorists will talk about how wonderful the world was under Muhammad's reign, and the years immediately thereafter, when people obeyed his precepts. And their entire project is based on returning history to what they regard as its true path, which is as was foretold by Muhammad. And this is an idea that history has some true path, and that we have to listen to some true prophet whose words were subverted by a group of evildoers. This is just a constant theme that comes up again and again and again. Among American members of the American religious right, or I'd say ardent conservatives more generally, sometimes this comes in the form of an almost religious or messianic appreciation of the Founding Fathers. So Glenn Beck, at the height of his appeal maybe a decade ago, would go on air and talk about Jefferson and Madison and Washington in terms that often are reserved in discourse for a discussion of saints. And in fact, one of Glenn Beck's favorite books, I think it's called The 5,000-Year Leap. I may be getting the title wrong, but I think that's what it's called. It had this thesis that linking the Christian mission with the creation of the United States. And the idea that sort of building a new Jerusalem was all linked up with the mission of the Founding Fathers, and that America had to be returned to this true path, which of course had been subverted by the New Deal and Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama and political correctness, and you name it, secular humanism, all you people. And that once those people were pushed out of the way or their agenda was defeated, you could get back to this nirvana. And then we already know the blueprint for nirvana. That's another common theme. Often, this is actually very interesting, as part of my project for writing the book, I explored some of the manifestos written by some of the more extreme feminists. These are feminists who are considered perhaps a little bit extreme, even in the academic community that self-identifies as feminists. And you have writers, I want to get her name, I think it's Mary Daly, might be one of these writers, who identify essentially the entire institution of manhood as being kind of a conspiracy against the inherent feminine. I guess now I'm getting to Dan Brown territory, but it does merge. The idea that humanity has this inherently peaceful feminine character, but it's been subverted by the patriarchy, and that the mission of academic feminists is to unmask this and return society to a gynocentric state. And often, in their literature, they will have, they're almost like the myths of old, where they will tell tales of this wonderful society that once existed in some ill-defined place and time, where women ruled the universe and everything was wonderful. And as I said, there's a popular theme. Our art designists will talk about the supposed wonders of the Jewish regimes that existed before the Titus destroyed Jerusalem. There is always a sort of backward-looking sentimentalism that comes with conspiracy theories, because they are, in a way, optimistic people. Optimistic in the sense that they're utopians. They believe that there's a utopia out there, and that if they can just unmask the villains, we can get there. This is why many communist societies become riven with conspiracy theories, because the entire basis of doctrine of Marxist communism, not coincidentally, like the religious ideologies that communism replaced in many societies, is based on the idea that a literal paradise awaits us if we are true to the doctrines of Marx. And when it doesn't happen, you have two options, right? You can say, well, I guess Marx was wrong, we wasted our lives, and this sucks. Or you could say, those kulaks did it. And they're destroying our smelters and selling our secrets to the capitalists, and let's exile them to Chechnya. So, and this happens in many societies. It's happening right now, unfortunately, in Turkey. And it's happening right now in places like Hungary, which has turned its conspiratorial attention on George Soros and the university that he's funded. And unfortunately, this is a soap opera that's drawing in Michael Ignatieff. I don't know if you folks have followed the story of what's called the New American University or something like that. That's it. And because it was originally founded with George Soros' funding. George Soros, by the way, has become this, he's become like this Goldstein figure for right-wing conspiracy theorists. And this includes American conspiracy theorists. And even some Canadian conspiracy theorists. If you turn on the Rebel website, I have an Israel Van site, they will trace everything back to either David Suzuki, George Soros, Justin Trudeau, me, the CBC, they hate the CBC. They have like a cast of 6 or 7 people who they kind of trace things back to. And this is one of the defining aspects of conspiracism, is that it isn't just a smoke-filled room that conspiracy theorists talk about. It's always a small room. If you look at those flowcharts that used to be popular in conspiracy theorist circles, you have like Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. They always went up to one cell. It was always one group, right? It was always the Illuminati, or the Freemasons, or the Jews. It was always some central organizing principle. The idea being that you had a dozen people who control the world. And you still get that now, whether it's bankers or Zionists. The template is the same, but the situation has become aggravated by the use of social media. And unfortunately, a lot of people who should know better get swallowed into it. And I have friends and relatives who I've seen this happen to. And often that's when I get the call, right? People say, oh, you wrote this book. And then they tell me this story about their uncle. And I'll say, yeah, I know that type, see page 47. or see page 61 or whatnot. But as I said, for all my study of this phenomenon, I never would have dreamed that the President of the United States would have suffered from these delusions. So I guess I come in the spirit of humility, because I didn't predict this. But I find it fascinating nonetheless, and thank you, I think, for sharing my enthusiasm for the subject. And maybe we could have more of a back and forth discussion at this point. Does that make sense?
That's fine.
Okay. Questions? Yes.
Just a general question on media bubbles and sort of only going onto the sites that support your beliefs. And is this going to be a huge problem going forward?
Oh, it's already a huge problem. And I have a chapter on this, and so it's interesting because one of the things I went back to is I went back to the JFK era. And in the JFK era, of course, as everybody famously knows, there's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about it. What makes the JFK conspiracy theories so fascinating is each one is different. And there's a book called, I think it's called Government by Gunplay. And it's like a digest of essays by people who think that the killing of JFK was a false flag operation, or it was done by the mafia or something, which actually isn't completely out of this world. But each theory is different, and it's interesting because in those days, conspiracy theories was kind of what I would call a sort of like boutique operation. You had 1,000 different people working on 1,000 different theories, and then eventually, they make leaflets, or they call into radio stations, or they write books, or they end up as associate professors at colleges, and they have to find ways to disseminate, but they have to be very creative. And sometimes they just literally stand on the street and give out leaflets. Like you go to Dallas in the 70s or 80s, and you go visit the old book repository, and there'd be some guy, and the only way he had to get his message out was just to stand there on his lunch break from Woolworths or whatever, and just hand you a piece of paper that said, "Here's the truth about how JFK died." And then the internet came, and what's very interesting about the effect of the internet is it actually streamlined conspiracism. And if you look at the theories about how the Twin Towers fell, like how so-called 9/11 truthers will describe how the Twin Towers fell, it's actually kind of boring once you studied it, because it's all, they sort of use the groupthink of the internet to sort of create a single theory of how it happened. It involves thermite. It involves, it was done under the guise of NATO Wargate. It was, Richard Gage is a very influential character in the 9/11 truther community because he's a former architect. And the mythology has kind of been codified in the same way that kind of Linux software was codified by open source, or a lot of software packages. You got a million people using the internet to create what's kind of a coherent canon of thought. And it often will happen very quickly. And it gets turbocharged by video. Video is the most effective form of propaganda that exists. And that wasn't something that was available to the JFK conspiracy theories, right? Because making a video in the 60s or 70s, you had to go down to your local PBS station or whatever. PBS didn't exist. Who had the resources to make a propaganda video except the government and major corporations? But Loose Change, I don't know if anybody here has seen Loose Change, which is, there you see it, Generation Zero, all these was done often on a shoestring or even for free. And those are extremely effective forms of propaganda. So a lot of the truthers or birthers or other conspiracy theorists I interviewed, when I always ask them, what was the moment of conception? When did you become a conspiracy theorist? And they'll say, it's like 1 a.m, and I was just, I was clicking on something, and one guy told me he was in some kind of rap music forum, chatting with some guy he just met about who knows what the rap part is. And there was a link, and he clicked it, and that's it. And he went down the rabbit hole. And he watched one video, and if anybody here's been on YouTube, or actually most of us, it's like, if you like this video, you might like. And, so it's not like the rabbit hole has an end. The rabbit hole has 15 exits to other rabbit holes. That's the way the internet works now. So the internet cross-fertilizes you. So, and I've seen this happen, like someone becomes, at first, they're into some esoteric conspiracy theory about the USS Liberty. Because I know there's some people here who were born in Egypt, so the USS Liberty has special significance. It's still not a completely explained phenomenon. But first they're getting to USS Liberty, and then they say, oh, Gulf of Tonkin, also kind of a sketchy incident, a legitimately sketchy incident.
Oh.
And then
USS Cole.
USS Cole, I think maybe we know a little bit more about, but you get the idea. Like, then there's all of a sudden, global warming is a scam. What, all these vaccines as population control. And, before you know it, you're in the Matrix, and it's the red pill and the blue pill. And it's not one conspiracy theory, it's 100. This wasn't necessarily the case in the JFK era. When I have a copy of Government by Gunfight. And when I read Government by Gunfight, at the end of the book, there aren't 99 other books that pop out of it, right? That's why if you meet JFK conspiracy theorists, they don't care about other conspiracies. They're specialists. These days you don't meet a lot of conspiracy specialists. They're cross-fertilized and all this stuff. And I think, is it the word silo you used about media? This is more worrying when you think of the people who aren't conspiracy theorists, but just are extremely narrow in their reading. I know a lot of people who, and by the way, I work with some of these people. I hate this so much. I'll be at work, and they'll say, oh, John, did you see the news about so-and-so? It's all over social media. And I'm like, no, it's not over social media. It's over your social media. Because, you're a 28-year-old film studies PhD with ultra-leftist tendencies, and you're in the LGBT community, and you're in this sub-niche community, and I'm in another sub-niche. I'm part of a lot of engineering groups, because I'm a former engineer. And there's some engineering stories that, bridge collapses in Europe, and my friends are fascinated by it. But I don't say, my God, did you see this bridge collapse? It's all over the news. So people in their sub-niche are completely obsessed with the news, and they don't read other news. And I see this, my mother is very politically active. She's a columnist. And I was having a discussion with her once, and she was telling me how global warming is a myth. And I'm like, whoa, when did that happen? I missed that. And she said, oh, it's all over. I mean, the final nail in the coffin was from that famous blog post. I'm like, well, what famous blog post? And then there was like some post on some blog I'd never heard of, but which is completely famous in her political niche. And everybody read it, everybody commented on it. And within a week, it had become received wisdom, and in fact, had become the basis for other people commenting. So that's the siloing effect. It's a big problem.